Welcome back to the series uncovering the Norse myths too dark for Disney. I'm Sarah, and if you've made it this far, you've already heard the complete, unvarnished truth about Loki's punishment, one of the most disturbing stories in all of world mythology. Today, in part 3, I'm going to show you exactly why this story and others like it will never see a Disney adaptation, and reveal the hidden darkness that lurks beneath even the seemingly lighter Norse myths. But first, let me address something that happened after Part 2 was released. I received hundreds of messages from viewers who couldn't believe that the story I told was actually from authentic Norse sources. Some people accused me of making it up or exaggerating for shock value. Others demanded to see proof that these stories really exist in the original texts. So let me be absolutely clear. Everything I told you about Loki's punishment comes directly from the Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, and other authentic Norse sources including the Poetic Edda and various saga literature. These aren't modern inventions or interpretations, these are stories that have been preserved for over 1,000 years, and scholars have been studying and translating them for centuries. The reason you've never heard these stories in their authentic form isn't because they don't exist. It's because of a systematic process of cultural sanitization that's been going on for hundreds of years. What I'm doing in this series is simply presenting the stories as they were originally told, without the layers of Christian influence, Victorian prudishness, and modern media filtering that have transformed them into something completely different. Now, to understand why Disney will never touch Loki's punishment, I need to explain the content evaluation process that major media companies use when deciding whether source material can be adapted for family audiences. I've obtained internal documents from several major studios that outline the specific criteria they use, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how these criteria apply to Norse mythology. The first criterion is violence level and graphic content. Disney has a strict policy against depicting violence involving children, torture, or graphic death scenes. Loki's punishment fails this test spectacularly. Not only does it involve the murder of children, but it involves forcing a parent to witness that murder and then using the children's remains as instruments of torture. There's literally no way to adapt this story without including content that would immediately disqualify it for family audiences. The second criterion is moral complexity and resolution. Disney stories require clear moral lessons with positive outcomes and redemptive character arcs. The punishment of Loki presents a universe where righteous characters commit acts that are morally ambiguous at best, and where there's no redemption, no learning, and no positive resolution. The story ends with eternal suffering presented as justified justice, which is the opposite of Disney's brand message. The third criterion is psychological impact and trauma. Disney avoids content that could be genuinely traumatic for young viewers, or that explores themes like hopelessness, eternal punishment, or the complete destruction of family bonds. Loki's punishment is specifically designed to be psychologically devastating, and it deals with themes that would require serious content warnings and therapeutic support for many viewers. But here's what's really interesting. Loki's punishment isn't even the only Norse myth that fails these criteria. The more I've studied authentic Norse mythology, the more I've discovered that virtually every major story contains elements that would be completely unsuitable for Disney adaptation. Take the creation myth of Norse cosmology. The world is formed from the dismembered corpse of the giant Ymir, with his blood becoming the oceans, his bones becoming mountains, and his brains becoming clouds. The gods literally butcher a sentient being and use his body parts to construct reality. Try turning that into a Disney musical number, or consider the story of Odin's quest for wisdom. The All-Father hangs himself from the world tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear without food or water, essentially committing suicide in order to gain knowledge of the runes. This is presented as a heroic act, but it's also a graphic depiction of self-harm and suffering that would trigger every content warning Disney has. Then there's the story of Signy's revenge, which involves incest, murder, and a mother burning her own children alive to achieve vengeance against their father, or the tale of Fenrir's binding, where the gods trick and betray a child who trusted them, setting up the very conflicts that will eventually destroy them all. The pattern becomes clear once you look at enough authentic Norse stories. These myths aren't just occasionally dark, they're fundamentally dark. They operate from a worldview that sees violence, suffering, and moral ambiguity as essential aspects of existence, not problems to be solved or overcome. This is because Norse mythology comes from a culture that lived with constant awareness of death, violence, and the precarious nature of existence. These were people who faced harsh winters, brutal wars, and uncertain futures on a daily basis. Their mythology reflects that reality. Their gods aren't perfect heroes. They're complex beings who struggle with the same challenges and moral dilemmas that humans face, just on a cosmic scale. But there's something even more significant that I discovered during my research, something that completely changed how I understand the purpose of these dark stories. They're not just entertainment or religious doctrine, they're psychological tools for processing trauma and preparing for harsh realities. The punishment of Loki, for example, isn't just a story about divine justice. It's a story about how betrayal destroys communities, how violence ripples outward to affect innocent people, and how some consequences can never be undone. It's a way for people to explore and process their fears about family dissolution, community breakdown, and the limits of forgiveness. When you look at it from this perspective, the graphic violence and disturbing imagery serve a specific purpose. They're designed to create a strong emotional response that makes the story memorable and impactful. They force the audience to confront difficult truths about human nature and the consequences of their actions. This is exactly what gets lost when we sanitize these stories for modern consumption. Disney's versions may be more pleasant and easier to watch, but they don't accomplish what the original stories were designed to do. They don't help us process difficult emotions, confront harsh realities, or prepare for the challenges that life inevitably brings. I've started to think of authentic Norse mythology as a kind of psychological vaccination. Just as medical vaccines expose us to weakened versions of diseases to build immunity, these dark stories expose us to controlled versions of trauma, betrayal, and loss to help us develop psychological resilience. When we remove the darkness, we remove the medicine. We create entertainment that may be pleasant but isn't particularly useful for navigating the complexities of real life. We lose access to wisdom that our ancestors considered essential for mental and emotional survival. This brings me to something that I think is crucial for understanding why these stories matter in our modern world. We live in a culture that's increasingly sanitized, where we are protected from harsh realities and difficult emotions in ways that previous generations never were. But this protection comes at a cost. We're seeing rising rates of anxiety, depression, and inability to cope with adversity, particularly among young people who've been raised on sanitized narratives that promise happy endings and easy solutions. Maybe part of the problem is that we've lost access to the psychological tools that previous cultures used to build resilience and process difficult emotions. I'm not suggesting that we should traumatize children with graphic violence, but I am suggesting that there's value in age-appropriate exposure to stories that acknowledge the darker aspects of existence and help us develop the emotional muscles we need to handle real-world challenges. The Norse myths, in their authentic form, provide exactly that kind of training. They don't promise that good always triumphs over evil, or that hard work always leads to success. They acknowledge that sometimes bad things happen to good people, that sometimes there are no happy endings, and that sometimes the best we can do is endure with dignity and maintain our values even when the world seems to be falling apart. These are lessons that Disney simply can't teach, because they conflict with the brand's fundamental message of optimism and wish fulfillment. There's nothing wrong with optimism and wish fulfillment, but they're not sufficient for navigating a world that includes genuine hardship, loss, and moral complexity. Now I want to address something that several viewers have asked me about. They want to know if there are any Norse myths that could be adapted by Disney, Any stories that aren't too dark for family consumption? The answer is complicated. There are certainly Norse myths that are less graphic than Loki's punishment, but virtually all of them contain elements that would require significant modification for Disney adaptation. Even the supposedly lighter stories involve violence, moral ambiguity, or themes that don't align with modern family entertainment values. Thor's visit to Utgard, which I mentioned in Part 1, is probably the closest thing to a Disney-adaptable Norse myth, but even that story involves deception, humiliation, and a worldview that celebrates trickery and might overwrite. It's not the kind of clear moral narrative that Disney prefers. The real issue isn't just individual stories, it's the entire moral universe of Norse mythology. These myths come from a culture with fundamentally different values than our own, values that prioritize honor over mercy, strength over kindness, and harsh justice over forgiveness. You can't adapt individual stories without either misrepresenting the culture they came from or creating content that conflicts with modern sensibilities. This is why Marvel's adaptations, while entertaining, bear so little resemblance to authentic Norse mythology. They've borrowed the names and some superficial elements, but they've completely transformed the moral universe to align with contemporary superhero conventions. There's nothing wrong with that approach, but it's important to understand that what we're getting isn't Norse mythology, it's modern fantasy inspired by Norse mythology. In Part 4, the final installment of this series, I'm going to show you exactly what an authentic adaptation of Loki's punishment would look like. I've created a complete dramatic reenactment script with staging directions, musical cues, and visual elements that capture the full emotional impact of this story as it was meant to be experienced. I'm also going to reveal what I believe these dark stories can teach us about resilience, community, and the importance of confronting difficult truths rather than avoiding them. And I'll share my theory about why understanding these authentic myths is more important now than ever before, as we face our own cultural challenges and need the psychological tools that previous generations developed for surviving adversity. But most importantly, I'm going to ask you a question that I've been wrestling with throughout this entire research project. In a world where we can choose between sanitized entertainment and authentic cultural wisdom, which do we really need more? The answer might surprise you, and it might change how you think about the stories we tell ourselves and our children about the nature of existence. Join me for Part 4, where we'll bring this dark journey to its conclusion and explore what it really means to confront the myths that are too dark for Disney.